Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gil Robertson. I am the president and founder of the African American Film Critics Association. We're the largest organization representing critics, black critics in the world. And I also run a vertical called Kaleidoscope Reviews, which provides a platform for journalists of color, of every color, sort of a pipeline for them to help build their portfolios, as they begin to, as they exit college and begin the process of looking for, gathering clips that they're going to need to get their first job. But this started because obviously this subject has been very much in the news, diversity within the space of entertainment journalism, film criticism in particular. And so as Hassan and I began to dialogue about this topic, we felt that it was important to put together a diverse panel that would allow working journalists an opportunity to share their experiences and to just offer some perspective on where they think the industry is headed in terms of these issues. So without further ado, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves.
All right. Hi, I'm Trish Bendix. I'm the managing editor of Into, which is Grindr's recently launched about a year ago, digital LGBTQ magazine. And I just want to start off by saying that I've been doing this for like 15 years as both a writer, critic, and now editor. So I've seen it from all different sides, and mostly I come to this as from the LGBTQ perspective. So that's been my focus for my entire career, and that's, I think, what I'm doing here. I'm the token lesbian today.
Hi. First of all, thank you for having me here, Gil. It's always a pleasure. My name is Carlos Aguilar. I'm a freelance journalist. I write for Remezcla, The Rap, Movie Maker magazine. Recently got my first piece on Voltaire, which was exciting. And I do a little bit of film screening, and I read screenplays for the Sundance Labs. I'm not the token Latino, I hope, but was born in Mexico, and I'm a DACA recipient for anyone that knows what that is. Okay.
Hi, my name is Dina-Ray Ramos. I'm an associate editor at Deadline Hollywood, and I'm also the co-host of the New Hollywood podcast at Deadline, which features underrepresented voices in film and television. And I've been doing this for about 15 years, and started off as kind of like a freelancer, and then just went from I worked at the Oakland Tribune in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Chronicle, and it's just been interesting to see just the media landscape in general, more than that, kind of where it's going for people of color, the LGBTQ community, and women. And especially in Hollywood, there's a lot to talk about. So there you go. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen Peterson. I write for awardcircuit.com, and I'm actually not sure how I ended up here. They just gave me a microphone and said, talks a little bit. So,
Lifesaver.
Thank you for having me. But I am the only woman on the staff at my site, actually, and so that gives me a little bit of an interesting perspective working with a bunch of men. But I also have the opportunity with this young lady here, and I'll let her talk a little bit more about it, but we actually also co-host a podcast called Citizen Dame that is for women that talk about film and television too. So,
thank you for that shout out to the podcast. I wasn't even going to say anything about it, but thank you. Hi, I'm Kristin Lopez. I'm a freelance film critic and writer affiliated with Rotten Tomatoes. I'm pretty much just overworked and underpaid. So I've written for The Hollywood Reporter, I've written for Remezcla, I've written for countless sites, mostly looking at feminism and disabled representation in film. I also review movies, and we do a podcast, called Citizen Dame, where we look at the film landscape mostly through the lens of being four women who run a podcast talking about film, since most of the movie podcasts that exist usually only have about one woman, maybe two, if they're lucky. So we wanted to change that.
So this is a great panel. I mean, we have equal representation of those of you who are on staff and those who are freelance, and I'll put myself in the category of being a freelancer. But for the editors, for those on-staff people, talk about what goes into how you make your assignments. What journalists, how do you identify the right journalist for a particular piece. Does race, does ethnicity, does sexuality, does gender come into that?
Well, I'll start with just saying that, like, it definitely weighs in for me. If there is something that okay, so for example, and I know this isn't film, it's TV, but it just came to me first, sorry. But for Vida, the Stars TV show, I definitely wanted to make sure a Latinx person was going to be writing about this series for us. And that doesn't mean exclusively if a white person or somebody of another race wants to pitch me a story on that, that's great. But I thought it was important for such a, like specific kind of show to at least get that viewpoint from a queer Latinx person. So that doesn't mean that I only go to that writer for Latinx themed things, but I specifically wanted to make sure that we were getting it from that perspective. And I think that's similar for most things, just because I don't like to assume that, of course, I have tons of white gay men at my disposal to review anything that I want them to review or write about whatever I want. But that doesn't mean that they should be the only ones allowed to write about Call Me By Your Name or, other things like that. I think that giving other critics the opportunity to weigh in with their opinions and their feelings, for the most part, is me going to someone that I think might also have an opposite viewpoint than the typical sort of heteronormative idea that we have, which is usually, so instead of a straight white male, it would be gay white male in my job, so yeah.
I think for me, it's a little bit different because Deadline is a considerably smaller staff than some of the other trades, and I'm lucky enough to where I can make the choice of posting certain stories. I think a lot of stories that I post, I don't think would get coverage if I wasn't there. So I kind of try to champion that. I try to push stories. And I think what also helps is, like, me and my co-host Amanda and Duca at New Hollywood, we are the only two people of color on our staff. And a lot of people come to us. I mean, it sounds weird, but I think this is when diversity in a newsroom helps, just like my diversity in a writer's room helps, or diversity in any any room helps, because you get certain perspectives you wouldn't normally get. So, like, for example, when they were doing coverage of Black Panther, they kind of crossed, they wrote this story and they were like, oh, hey, does all this sound okay? And it all did. But it was nice that they came to us to kind of just go through those avenues of, like, we don't want to offend anyone, but they ended up not. But I think with me, it's just like I'm just lucky enough to kind of push for stories, push for people who aren't getting representation. These actors who are people of color, who are women, who are queer, who are just like, that don't get the normal coverage that they deserve. It's an interesting landscape in especially in Hollywood in the trade organization. But I'm just happy that I could push for things that wouldn't normally get coverage.
And what you speak to, unfortunately, is a sad reality. If, very often, if there's not a person of color, just talking about it from the standpoint of running an organization filled with critics of color, Black film critics, it can be very difficult. If you don't have an ally, someone in there who can advocate, someone who considers the news that you have to share a priority, it can be very difficult. But please continue.
Oh, me?
No,
oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Well, I don't make the assignments at my site, but I definitely do have the ear of our editor. And we have these conversations all the time when certain films are coming up. Who is the right person to write about this? Which of our writers should be conducting this interview? Is this the time that we should go look for a freelance writer to write about this instead? And it's definitely a conversation that we're constantly having. I think one of the advantages that we have is that our editor is half Puerto Rican and half Black. And so he already is used to looking at things from a more diverse lens than your typical white male editor. So I think that really helps a lot.
Right.
Oh, well, I mean,
on the flip side of it, as a freelancer, for you and Carlos, and I know that a lot of the stories, not all of them, but certainly a healthy number of the stories that I've read from you, Carlos, do talk about things that themes that are directly related to the Spanish diaspora, but that are that speak to the value and importance of that audience. Do you feel a certain pressure to advocate that if you weren't there, maybe those stories would fall on deaf ears? Both of you, in terms of, you know, someone with a disability. You know, do you feel that your voice in speaking with your editor helps those stories find a platform?
Sure. Yeah, I think that there's been many occasions in which a story has been published because I pitched it and I show interest. You know, just talking about the most recent thing I wrote on for Vulture. It's a story about the show BoJack Horseman, and one of the characters, Todd Chavez, is always been ambiguously Latino or not, and nobody really knows. And you know, I wanted to investigate that, and when I pitched it to the editor there, he was very shocked that nobody had written about it because the show was on its fifth season. You know, so nobody had gone after that. So I went and I spent like a month and a half, you know, pursuing people and writing about it. You know, and it happened because I had a invested interest in getting this story out there. And one of the most interesting things that the creator of the show told me specifically about this character and about a scene with Latino actors in it was that when you only surround yourself with white people, you're going to continue only hiring white people. And if you surround yourself with others, more stories and more interesting perspectives come. So I don't feel pressure, but I do take it seriously as a responsibility, you know, to write about those things. I write about foreign language films and animation and other things, but I do make a point, you know, and sometimes it's kind of like you become the token person. Like last year when Trump decided to resign DACA, and I was the only person or film writer that was a DACA recipient, so a lot of people came to me to, can you write something about this? Because I was, you know, the one connection they had, and it was interesting to be that voice, whether I wanted it or not, you know, and try to perhaps, you know, if you have a little bit of a platform, how do you use it? What do you say? So it is not pressure, but a responsibility to have to, you know, open spaces like that.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, to go off of what Carlos was saying, it's very easy to become the token person when people need something written. One of the first pieces I ever was like outright commissioned to do was about A Quiet Place, and they wanted a disabled or deaf writer to talk about the representation. And I got so many tweets from people saying, Kristen's the one that you're going to want to reach out to. And everybody I know kind of sends me tweets about, oh, this person's looking for somebody to look at something from a disabled experience. So it is very easy to become complacent. And, you know, as a freelancer where you're chasing that dollar, you're always happy to have an opportunity where you have a niche that you can kind of write about. But at the same time, I always tell people I should not be the only person talking about disabled representation because there are so many different disabilities out there. I don't speak for all of them, nor should I. And, you know, all I hope to do with my platform is hopefully get more disabled critics or pop culture writers out there who feel like somebody wants to read these stories. Somebody wants to know whether these movies are doing a good job or a bad job and why. And so many opportunities I've gotten have been telling a writer, you know, Christopher Robin's daughter actually had cerebral palsy and that's not in the movie. And they'll say, well, I didn't know that. Well, now you do. Let me write about why that's a problem. So it's kind of just opening people's eyes to stuff that they're not thinking of. I know that Karen and I have been friends for a while, and she'll tell me all the time, I don't think of those things that you think of when it comes from a disabled experience until you and I became friends, and now I notice those things. And so that's kind of what I've been doing with my writing is, you know, if I can slowly tell people that they should be looking at these things, then maybe other people will as well.
I just want to say that I think that's so important, like as an editor, for when a writer pitches me something that specific, something that no one else is thinking, an angle that you haven't seen, it does, like, I know it can feel like, you know, as a writer, I felt this myself, but like a specific niche and that people are going to come to you and like, that's all you can do, or that you're going to be like the only voice of like the lesbian community, and like that shouldn't be the case. But sometimes, you know, you are able to share this one idea that nobody else is going to know about or be able to execute in the way that you're going to be able to do it. And so I am always so grateful to writers when they pitch me that something that nobody else is talking about, like your Vulture piece. I really love that story, by the way.
It's not as obvious, you know, because when last year when Coco was released, I think that most people would assume that outlets would want someone who's Mexican or Mexican American or has that background to write about this movie, right? Because it's such a landmark film for Latinos in general, but specifically for the Mexican community. And what we found out with my editor, Vanessa Erazo at Remezcla, it was that not a single major outlet had any Latinos reviewing Coco. Every single review out there was from the perspective of mostly white male or white women. So what she did, Remezcla's a site that only covers Latino stories. She found all these Latino critics, and we wrote capsule reviews as a kind of antidote to this, crazy fact that no Latino had a chance to write about it. And it's happened multiple times since then, like the movie Peppermint or Sicario, and things that are not, they're not directed by Latinos, but they kind of have a content that affects us or kind of reflects us in a negative way. So even when you think it's obvious that an outlet will go after someone Latino to write, or a person of color to write a story, sometimes they don't really think about that.
Yeah. Going off of that, like when Crazy Rich Asians came out, I don't want to say that the spotlight was put on me at work, but it kind of was. They're like, "Oh, you have something to say about this? This is your people," But. I mean, I'll be totally honest. When Crazy Rich Asians was planned, and I was immediately skeptical, because how Hollywood could be, I was just like, first of all, it's like the title was problematic to me. This is just me, snap judgment. I was just like, okay, I don't know if this is gonna be representative of me. And then I watched it, and I was like, oh, this is what struck me was I was like, this is a good romantic comedy, and the Asian American part was kind of put on the side. But I was like, oh, it's a good romantic comedy, but also it has all these dope-ass Asian actors in it, and now they're getting this glow up, and now look at Henry Golding, his fine ass is all over the place. And I know, right? I've been scrolling to his Instagram, and I was like, God damn it, you and your wife are so damn hot.
Why are we just now finding out about it?
But anyways, it's and then when my coverage of Crazy Rich Asians, I didn't review it, because Deadline doesn't, we have a film reviewer, and I really did want to review it, but that's not my lane at Deadline. So I kind of just carved my own lane out, and I interviewed John M. Chu, and I was just like, the whole point of the interview with him was oh, this is not the end all of Asian American representation in film, because that's just one narrative, and there are how many Asian races out there, So I think when it comes to kind of just finding stories that represent you, I was just happy that Crazy Rich Asians came out, so I could start exploring different avenues of Asian American representation within film and television.
Well, and to go off that, there's kind of a dichotomy there when people want you to praise something because it's new, and then they also don't want you to call out something that's problematic. I get asked all the time by people, what is the best movie about disability that you recommend? And I say there is none. I mean, maybe Best Years of Our Lives, but that's it. That's the only one I recommend with any type of love. Everything else I despise. And people get very upset about that. They're like, well, you can't, not everything is perfect. You can't get everything that you want. And I say, okay, well, the least I want is an actor who is disabled playing a disabled character. I don't want Jake Gyllenhaal to get an Oscar for playing a disabled person, looking, and that's not to say that the performance isn't good, but it's the concept of Hollywood greenlights movies about disability specifically that are based on very ingrained patterns about what they think disability is. And when you start critiquing those, people get very defensive, even though you don't think they would, but when somebody of that group is saying this is problematic, they get very, very protective of it. And it's even harder when you watch, I look at big magazines that review the quote-unquote Oscar bait movies about disability that use just really problematic ableist language. They don't know how to describe things, and they use the buzzwords that just annoy most people with disabilities. And you're sitting there thinking, this is why you need a person with at least, the race or the gender or the disability, writing those things, because then you're going to get angry comments from people saying, why didn't you just have somebody of that group doing it? And they don't, because nobody thinks to really complain, I guess, that loudly.
the problem is that there's so few movies about people of color that when one comes out, it becomes the thing. You know, there's Crazy Rich Asians, there's Black Panther, there's Coco. So there's all the attention is in one. So people expect you to be overly positive because they're doing you a favor. You know, it's like, oh, Hollywood finally look at you, so you should be thankful, rather than use that as a platform to have more than just one movie that's supposed to represent all Latinos or all Asians. You know, so that's the big problem. I feel that it's just one opportunity you get to be in the spotlight, and if you kind of mess with that, then you won't get another chance.
Yeah, like.
But in the newsroom, how do you strike that balance? I'm asking the editors again because, on the one hand, you want news, you want reporting, and on the other hand, you want authenticity. And so, how do you balance both of those?
Well, I can say, luckily at Into, we have the luxury of not saying we're doing one story on this movie and that's it, and it's going to be like a straight-on news report or a straight review. It's like I am able to accept multiple pitches with different angles and different sorts of ideas. Like we have one column called How Gay Is It? And so every Friday, it's one movie that's coming out that's like a major film, and sometimes it's really gay, and sometimes it's totally not gay at all. It's like, how gay is Black Panther? And so it'll be like, here's the possibly gay aspects of this. Is it really gay? I don't know. It's just funny. But then I'll get, several other pitches from different writers about, a certain film. And so just depending on that angle, depending on, the writer themselves. And so I'm lucky in that way. I think it's probably different and more like probably a deadline. But
yeah. So what was the question again? It's how do I balance
authenticity with
news.
The need to get the news out?
Well, honestly,
the need to get it right.
Yeah, the need to get. Well, deadline is I think each editor, each writer, we are constantly putting out content, and sometimes we don't get time to breathe. So it's kind of like sometimes I have to think on the fly a lot, and I just kind of trust my gut instinct. I think with me it's hard because sometimes when I'll admit when people find out I work at Deadline, a lot of people in the industry read Deadline, and I have a lot of friends in the industry, and they'll come to me and be all, I have this project, will you write about me? And then that's just a whole mess of problems. There's conflict of interest, whatever. But I'm just I look for something that's, something special or something that I think is newsworthy. And then, of course, a lot of the time I write about pretty much everything, but I am very much embedded into the diversity inclusion stuff at Deadline, and I write a lot about kind of genre not just underrepresented voices in terms of women, people of color and that, but underrepresented talent in general who are doing a lot of genre stuff. So what I look for is something that interests me, but I also kind of trusting my editorial instinct. And it's kind of hard to explain because it's and then half the time I'm writing about Trump tweeting about, whatever he's tweeting about, or Cosby, or the Me Too movement. So a lot of what I do is I write about a potpourri of stuff, and at the end of the day, I just want to eat a burrito and go to sleep. But in terms of authenticity, it's I don't assign people, because Deadline doesn't use a lot of freelancers. So, and I'm at the bottom of the rung when it comes to editors. So if an editor doesn't like it, they'll just pass it down until it comes to me, and I'll take it and I'll just write it. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to, I think with me, there is a way to report the news, especially with a publication like Deadline. And I come from the old school journalism world. I used to write for the Oakland Tribune. I was a staff writer there when, I don't know if anyone here has worked in newspapers, but before, a lot of newspapers, they used to measure length in inches, so that they'll be all I need a 7-inch story for this, and that's my old school journalism. I think I came up in the time of journalism when it was right at the cusp of online and print was dying. So I grew up with that. So for me, it's about being able to report something as authentically as possible, but without being biased, and that's kind of the challenge.
I think one thing that I've had a lot of conversations with people about they'll be afraid to say if they didn't like a film, such as Crazy Rich Asians, because they're afraid that they won't be invited by the studio to cover anything else. And I just try to tell people, if you don't like something and you have a really specific reason, just be really honest about that and tell people, hey, this is a problem because of this, or this, I didn't connect to this storyline for these reasons. And if you're really specific and honest with people, it doesn't matter. They don't necessarily need you to love it. They just need you to be able to say why you didn't sometimes.
There's that problem. Like, I was wondering, I was like, what if I didn't like Crazy Rich Asians? Would I have been kicked out of the Asian club? I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of trash out there, and there's a lot of, Asian filmmakers that have made films that I haven't liked. I'm honestly, sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm scared to say something because I'm Asian. And it's like, oh, you're not supporting the culture, you're out. Same with like LGBT, movies and stories. If there's
take the card back.
Yeah. I did not. I don't know if I'm gonna offend people here. I did not like Looking that much. So it's just like, but I was afraid to say something because they're like, oh, that's your people. You have to like it.
The need to kind of make the community happy
Yes.
is very, very real. Like I remember praising Skyscraper, the rock action movie, because I was like, it's a step forward. It's actually a disability that's not the focus of the movie. It's just a facet of his personality. It's no different than if he had brown eyes. I'm like, it's just part of who he is. I'm like, that's the step. That's not, we did not solve disabled representation in cinema. We have a long way to go, but it is the changing of minds, because so much of this is not just changing how a screenwriter or director thinks about a minority, it's changing how the studio thinks about that minority, because we all know the studios only think in dollars and cents, and if they can't find a way to get mass audiences to see it, they're not going to make it. And so when it comes to disability specifically, that's why the same narratives are employed over and over, because they assume able-bodied people will go see that narrative. And so people in the disabled community got very mad at me. They were like, it's pandering and it's still awful. And I was like, at the same time, yes, it's not a perfect 100% movie, nor should it be. But it is at least acknowledging that people don't want to see a disabled experience where it's inspirational, it's courageous, it's watching somebody die beautifully for 90 minutes. It's just making it a fact of a character. And that's got to be a step that has to be acknowledged.
I think that as a freelancer, specifically speaking about myself, you get to go after the stories that you want to write. So, you don't really get assigned stuff. But writing for the Wrap recently, that I'm assigned some reviews a month. There was a film that they assigned me. It was a Mexican film. And I know the people that represent the film. I know some of the filmmakers, and I went to watch it, and I really, really hated it. I thought it was a terrible movie as a film. But in my review, I said all those terrible things about it, but I gave the context of, like, this is the company that made it. This is what this company exists. This is the people that they're marketing it at. This is why this film is important, in spite of the fact that it's terrible as a film, but this is kind of contextualizing why the film still mattered and why they keep on making them, and there's an audience for that. And and I feel like if someone else had reviewed that film, they would have just trashed it without any context or without any kind of meaningful exploration why this film exists and why is it out there. I wasn't positive on it just because it was a Mexican film, but I did try to at least explain why this is out there and who's watching these type of movies, which is geared to a specific audience. And I think that's lost sometimes on when the person that's reviewing the film or writing about it doesn't have any context, And it happens when I pitch an editor and, they're like, I pitch something about a Mexican film or Latino film, and they're like, oh, we just reviewed Roma, or we wrote about Roma, so we're good on Latino stuff right now. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we could cover one a month, basically, and that's it. We have a quota of how much we, because otherwise the side becomes a Latino side. It's like when they cast a movie, you could have one Latino, but if you put three of them, then it's a Latino movie. It's strange.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to have, a lot of representation, because so we have something to choose from, if that makes any sense. Like, that there isn't just a Crazy Rich Asians, there isn't just Coco. And that's why I was really happy with what they were calling Asian August, is because we had Searching, which was totally different from Crazy Rich Asians, and then we also had on Netflix To All the Boys I Loved Before. That's the name of it, right? I always forget because it's long and I'm not good. And those were 3 totally different movies, and they all did well. And I want, like, for the Asian American community at least, it's like, or for any marginalized community, we need to have more permission to fail. I guess that's the way to say. It's like because like if you have like, let's say, how many movies have like Brad Pitt made that are trash? You know, what was that one? Oh, there was that. Oh, the one with Julia Roberts. That was horrible. What's it called? The Mexican? Oh yeah. So I was like, what the hell? You know, or like any mainstream, they could fail, and they're fine. But if an Asian American movie fails, they're like, oh, that's it. We can't do that anymore. Or if it was a queer movie, I mean, I think Hollywood maybe is like a little bit more lenient on LGBTQ community movies, just because they're like, oh, okay, we see that they're people now. But if like an Asian, like especially with the Asian, like Crazy Rich Asians was the first major studio movie in 25 years since Joy Luck Club. But between Joy Luck Club and Crazy Rich Asians, there were so many Asian American movies that no one was watching. No one really watched Spa Night, which I thought was phenomenal.
So good. So good.
There was also Gook, which was like so amazing, and like Justin Chon, I think he's just a very visual. I think he's a visual talent when it comes to filmmaking. But no one was really talking about those because those were indie movies. But those are like those 2 movies should have been more in the mainstream, so we have choices. I mean, and I think that's why representation is important, so that we could have things to kind of like and not like.
You had something to say?
Oh, no, I'm good.
How much of a game changer has the internet played in opening the door for a greater number of voices?
I would say it's fun. It's like a fundamental component. I mean, you can't really be a film critic in this day and age and not have Twitter in some way and interact with people. And that's good and bad, because if you say something bad about a movie, sometimes the director will tweet you and tell you why you're wrong.
Yes,
so that,
they have.
and at the same time, I mean, it leads to a double-edged sword, especially for women writers. Most of us got our start on the internet and writing for, either our own blogs or writing for smaller sites. And now what we're seeing with the rise of the film Twitter culture, as we call it, there's a lot of what we kind of call film bros, which is the male white, usually white male straight critic who has a website of their own and is writing just puff pieces to get attention, and are rising up the ranks, but they're not good writers, and they don't support minority voices or women, or they say they do, and in private, once you're actually part of their team, they don't. And so there's this internet culture that kind of permeates, where it's the white male critic who feels that he's going to be usurped if the minority critics come and take their job, and then there's us who are just trying to do good work, who want to be on the internet, but there's just so much harassment, there's so much mistreatment of minority voices on Twitter that leads a lot of writers to really doubt their voice and doubt themselves and doubt whether they should continue in this business because of just how the internet makes everything good and makes everything horrible simultaneously.
But I think something else that the internet has done really well is it's given a lot of creators a platform. And so there's a lot more to see. There's a lot more to enjoy. There's a lot more art being created for us to write about as well. And so that's been a really big opportunity. We're not just seeing the same things, whatever the studios want to put into the theater. We can watch Hulu and Amazon and Netflix, right in our homes. And the stories that are coming through those platforms are just amazing and full of inclusive casts and people behind the scenes as well, and directors with new, interesting voices. So.
And it's still not enough because, there's every time a big movie opens, there's 30 think pieces on the new Marvel movie, 100 stories on, whatever tentpole's out that week, but nobody's covering, there's 25 movies opening every week in LA and New York, indie movies, foreign language films. So in my case, what I did, because even, as a freelancer, it's hard to get any outlet to care for international cinema or animation or whatnot. So I do a podcast called One Week Only, in which we only talk about films that usually get 1 week runs, so that we focus only on that, and that's an outlet for me to covering all those things. So I think podcasts have become also an outlet to get even more coverage, because online stuff is still really focused on the major awards contenders or whoever has a star. And just going back to what Kristen was saying, the fact that there's so few of us and there's so few jobs, I always feel like, I don't want to be competing against all the Latinos for the one job for a Latino that's on that outlet, because they clearly could only have one Latino writer and that's it. So it always feels like, not a competition, but it is, it's cutthroat, and is what do you do when you see an outlet only hiring one person of color and that fills their quota and that's that. So it creates competition among people that I think it's kind of disturbing.
I've definitely found writers on Twitter, writers that use Twitter threads to talk about films, to point out certain aspects of them that I'm like, are you writing about this anywhere? And then they will say no, and I'm like, great, can I pay you to write about this here? And putting out calls for submissions and pitches. Twitter is probably the most beneficial to me out of any social media platform. But I think it's also very helpful in terms of helping, like when you were talking about your site that helps provide new writers with a platform, offering up the ability to mentor and work with new writers by putting out, like one time I was just saying, like, hey, if there's any QTPOC that have questions about pitching, that have any questions about submissions, any questions about if a certain place pays or not, it's a really easy way to start connecting with people that don't have that access and privilege, that you can then extend your knowledge or whatever help you can. And I think that's so valuable, especially for people that, younger people that now want to contribute to this conversation and see that they're missing, people are missing out. I get pitches from people all the time with very specific, like, I'm asexual and I'm not seeing myself represented in film, or this television character that's asexual is so abhorrent, and here is why. So Twitter is very, very beneficial to me.
You pay?
Yes, yes.
I agree. It's like,
and Grindr.
I also think Twitter kind of makes you connect with your tribe in a way. I guess you would say, I met a bunch of Asian American writers, and now journalists who we meet up once a month, and we complain about how we're misrepresented, and then we leave. We do more than that. We eat and drink. But no, I think it's Twitter is very beneficial. But also you get the trolls. I've been trolled plenty of times. I got followed by Asians for Trump, which was really weird, and I was like, oh no, thank you. But yeah, I do enjoy, and I hate and I love Twitter, I guess I would say. But yeah, I use Twitter a lot. I still use Facebook. Even though I know my parents love it, and I'm like, oh, it's not cool anymore because my parents use it. But I use it. I use everything. So I'm a social media whore. So go look for me.
Well,
Twitter also teaches us who the false allies are.
Yes. I was going to say, to go off of that, we were, Twitter is great. Slack is also really good. Yes. I'm part of a female writers Slack group where we can kind of pitch ideas and swap, if somebody's looking for someone online, we can bemoan the state of the patriarchy and all of that in a very safe space. And it does lead to kind of this nice little girl gang community that I have, where if one of us sees somebody being trolled on Twitter, we all usually pile on the troll and tell him, it's usually him. Usually tell them why they're wrong. So there is that nice fostering of community and
a support
feeling
group.
Right, we're all in this mess together, and we all need to uplift each other, and when it works, it's really great.
And complaining on Twitter works, because I've gotten gigs out of telling Twitter that I wanted to write about something recently about Roma, because I was like, I grew up in Mexico City. I am Mexican. I should be writing about Roma, and I haven't. And a couple days later, someone emailed me, "Hey, we want to pay you to write about Roma." And I was like, "I guess Twitter work." Sometimes it happens.
Well, I think even Roxane Gay not that long ago wrote, "I really want to write." I forgot what it was. Oh, I really want to write about Insatiable. On Netflix. Yeah. Who wants to pay me to write about that? And obviously Refinery 29 won because I kept paying attention to who had got paid her enough that she would want to write about it. But I think a lot of writers are still utilizing those things. I think even those that are paid tons of money because they're highly coveted sort of opinions from writers. So I think that's such a great idea, and I don't think it looks too thirsty.
Yeah. No, it's and Twitter helps so much because back in the day. Before Twitter existed and you would just be a freelancer, there would be this huge thick book called The Writer's Guide, I think it was called. And it was like 2,000 pages or something, and it would list all the publications, what they paid, or what their kill fee was, how you pitched them. Some of them you would write a letter, send it in the mail, and you wouldn't hear back until 4 months later and be all, you could write this piece. But now it's so instantaneous. You could just be all, I want, Roxane Gay. She was like, I want to write about. Well, it's also Roxane Gay, so that's a different story. But with Carlos, you just say, hey, I want to write about this. You just kind of throw bait out there and hope someone bites.
I mean, so in essence, and we're running out of time, unfortunately, it becomes a question of integrating the pipeline that employers are pulling from for their hires. What one suggestion would you give to how do we do that? How do we encourage a diverse body of young people to throw their hat into entertainment journalism, a career as an entertainment journalist?
Well, they gotta know it doesn't pay much. First of all, it's very difficult to earn a living off of it. You have to freelance, and if you get a staff gig, that's kind of like the holy grail. But I started when I started 6 years ago. I had a Blogspot blog that I read myself. Nobody else ever wrote it. And then I pitched to some small outlet, and someone on IndieWire read it, and they asked me to write for the blog on IndieWire, and it kind of rolled. I don't think there's a specific path, but I do think that using the internet and just even if you think nobody's gonna read it, just having a sample or something that you could show for when the opportunity comes, I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think it only takes one yes, right? And I think also use your resources. And for those who kind of are scared to try, I mean, you just have to do it. I come from a military immigrant family. My parents, I'm part of that narrative of you're gonna be a doctor, an engineer, whatever, and that whole kind of antiquated system. But I just kind of worked my ass off and just held I got paid at one time through DVDs so I could write, and at the same time I was working at Dell in Austin. It's just weird, but I think you just have to do it. If you really want to do it, then it's gonna be for you. But if not, if you don't try, you never know.
I always say that there's kind of different levels that always help. Twitter is a great resource to actually interact with editors just on a personal level. Don't send them a pitch via DM or anything like that, but just interact with them so that they recognize your name. And when you do eventually pitch them, they'll have this type of burgeoning relationship with you that always helps. I always tell people, if you are fortunate to go to film festivals, that's great. Try to meet other writers that way. It's all, I hate to say it's networking, but that's a really big thing, at least in my experience. It's not just having the portfolio and the ability to write, but it's also just being a great conversationalist and being able to kind of have conversations with people, and maybe that fosters ideas, and just always be thinking of something that you can write about. I was telling them that in the back before, I don't watch a lot of things for enjoyment. I'm always watching something with, how can I monetize this? How can I find a way to write something about that? And sometimes the best ideas come from just interacting with other writers who have seen that same thing and kind of coming out with it that way. So it helps to have friends who are writing who can understand all the different things that are happening.
Right.
But I think it's really important, too, that writers really understand who they are and what they think. And because we see so often, a movie will premiere at a festival and a whole bunch of writers, they're kind of caught up in that festival bias, which is a very real thing, and they're all saying essentially the same thing about this movie. And maybe they really do think that, maybe they don't. And as a writer who's trying to get into that business, I think that you need to not worry so much about making sure that your opinion aligns with the majority of people that are writing, but that it's really true to who you are and what you believe and how you are interpreting that art that you're seeing.
Especially as a marginalized person, I mean, you're going to have a totally different view of a film than, especially this conversation has been happening so much with trans, roles played by cis actors recently, and so the trans community is obviously like, this is not cool. This is why this should not be happening anymore. And finally, I think Hollywood is like listening a little bit. But the only way that these things are going to be talked about is with social media, famous people using their platform in any way to talk about this. But there are still not that many like trans public people, but hopefully that's growing. And then writers like us who are going to, and editors who are going to allow for this conversation to happen, for us to make sure that this is especially in the LGBT media, but also in mainstream media, that we are also allowing trans writers to, create this conversation, to direct this conversation. So I just think it's, when you are the right person for the right thing, I know it can feel very tokenizing at sometimes, but I would really encourage you to sort of lean into that if that's the kind of writing you want to do, unless you want to do just like straight reviews for, a certain place. Like I think, just echoing the knowing yourself and what you kind of stand for. It's weird to do. I feel like sometimes as a marginalized person, you're sort of an activist in a way and also a writer, and you have to try to find those lines, and sometimes they're a little bit blurry, but I still think leaning into the fact that you're coming at this from a completely different perspective than maybe we've seen before. Like, just as an example, I went back and read a 1995 review of Wild Things recently in Entertainment Weekly, and it was the most sexist, like lesbophobic, like it was terrible. And I'm like, they printed this bullshit. Sorry to anybody that likes Entertainment Weekly, but so like obviously, as a queer person, as a woman, I would have like a vastly different response to that film. So that's just my example. Go back and read it. You guys will love it.
It still happens, the reviews for Coco last year by white writers would use very kitschy Spanish language where there was a fiesta, fiesta and margaritas and piñatas, every Spanish language word that they could think of was thrown in there in a very kind of corny way that I was like, no, stop it, this is bad.
We certainly wish the conversation could go on longer, but for those members of our audience and our extended audience online who want to remain connected with you, how can they do that?
On Twitter.
On Twitter.
What are your handles?
Yes, my handle is my name, Trish Bendix, Trish, B as in boy, Endix, and follow Into. It's just at Into.
My handle is Carlos_film.
My handle is at Dino-Ray, Dinoray, and you could listen to the podcast New Hollywood. You can find it on wherever you listen to, your podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, all that good stuff.
I am at Karen M. Peterson, and you can find our podcast, Citizen Dame, at Citizen Dame Pod.
Thank you for that shout out again. I don't have a cool kitschy Twitter handle. I really need to change mine. It's at Journeys_film. That's the name of the film blog I started back in the day, and I still have that film blog, but I really need to change the handle.
Stay true to yourself, girl.
Where can we find you?
Thank you. You can find me on Twitter at TheAFCA, that's TheAAFCA, and on Instagram at AAFCA, and on Facebook, because I do go to Facebook, at African American Film Critics Association, or just Gil Robertson across all of those platforms. Thank you so much, and you guys have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.